When I saw my husband unpacking that velvet box at the dinner table, my breath caught, but not from excitement. It wasn't the good kind of surprise, it was the heavy, sinking kind, the kind that pressed against your ribs and whispered, "You waited too long." He placed the box between us, his eyes darting away, as if the act of giving would absolve him of years of absence. I stared at it, at the neat bow, the promise of something inside, and felt the weight of all the dinners we didn't share, all the nights we slept back to back. My hand trembled when I opened it, revealing a bracelet too shiny, too deliberate, and I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. He thought the gesture would fix the cracks, but the cracks had already become canyons. Across the street, through the rain-smeared window, I noticed movement, boxes stacked in a driveway, a man laughing as he wrestled with a crooked bookshelf. A new neighbor, I realized. A stranger carrying pieces of his life inside those walls, while mine sat silently, as if preserved in dust. My husband asked, "Do you like it?" and I nodded automatically, my gaze still drifting toward the house across the street. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was something quieter, more dangerous, a spark of curiosity in a life that felt like an echo. I remember thinking, it's nothing, just a moment, but 3 months later, that moment would feel like the first domino. And before I tell you how it all began, how one careless, innocent gesture turned into something I could never undo, tell me in the comments, have you ever looked at someone and known, deep down, that your life might be about to change, even if you didn't understand how yet? There's something about a quiet house that can be louder than a crowded room. That evening, after the bracelet sat cooling on my wrist like a piece of unspoken guilt, the silence pressed in around me. My husband turned on the news, his voice blending into the hum of the TV as he muttered something about tomorrow's schedule. I nodded without hearing, the kind of nod you learn after decades of marriage, the one that means I'm here, but I'm not listening. Our house had become a museum of habits. The same mugs on the same hooks, the same faint stain on the carpet from the time I spilled coffee years ago, the same hallway we walked through without touching. I could map our routine in my sleep, him leaving before dawn, his tie slightly crooked, the coffee still hot when the door shut, me filling my days with errands, laundry, the dull thrum of obligation. It wasn't an unhappy life. That's what made it so dangerous. It wasn't broken enough to leave, but it wasn't alive enough to stay whole. The neighbor's arrival changed nothing at first. I saw the moving truck the next morning, parked diagonally across the street, its ramp down like a tongue. I stood at the window with my tea, telling myself I was only curious. He carried boxes with an ease that made his movements almost careless, laughing when one slipped, catching it with a quick twist of his body. A few neighbors waved, but I didn't. Not yet. I only watched. Later that day, I found myself pausing by the window again, longer this time. He was unloading something heavy, a mirror, maybe, and for a moment his eyes swept across the street, not stopping on me exactly, but close enough that I felt exposed. I stepped back quickly, almost embarrassed, as if he'd caught me in some small trespass. My husband came home that evening with another token of thoughtfulness, a new scarf, this time, stuffed hastily into a shopping bag. "Saw it on the way home," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. I smiled and thanked him, the way I always did, and tucked the scarf into the closet where the others lived, unworn. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how love ages. Not the loud, dramatic kind of aging, no fights, no slammed doors, but the slow erosion, the kind that feels like a whisper saying, "You don't notice it now, but one day you will." The next morning, I caught myself humming while I washed dishes, a strange, almost foreign sensation. I realized it wasn't the bracelet, the scarf, or even my husband's fleeting gestures that made me feel something. It was that tiny glimpse of life outside my window, the sound of someone moving in, the reminder that change existed, just not here, not yet. When I went to the grocery store that afternoon, I bought our usual items, the ones I could list blindfolded. But when I reached for the bread, I thought about the boxes, the laughter, the unfamiliar energy across the street. I told myself it was just curiosity, the harmless kind, the sort you have about someone new on your street. But later that night, as I placed the bracelet on my bedside table, I couldn't shake the thought, curiosity is where everything begins. The next morning the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining, the kind of pale gray sky that makes everything look softer but heavier somehow. I lingered over my coffee longer than usual, staring out the window at the house across the street. Boxes still lined the driveway, their cardboard darkened by the storm, and a crooked welcome mat had been tossed near the door. He was out there early, stacking empty cartons, his sleeves rolled up, his hair damp as though the rain had caught him again on his way out. I told myself I was only watching because there was little else to see. The neighborhood was usually so still in the mornings that even a moving truck felt like an event. But something about the way he worked, focused but unhurried, made me restless. It wasn't attraction, not exactly, not yet. It was something closer to envy. He seemed like a man in motion, while I felt like I'd been standing still for years. By midday, I found myself looking for excuses to step outside. I told myself the hedges needed trimming and fetched the clippers from the garage, though the hedges were tidy enough. He waved when he saw me, just a polite flick of his hand, the kind you give a neighbor. I returned the wave, hoping my face didn't betray how strangely significant that small gesture felt. Later, I noticed him struggling with a large, flat box near the edge of his truck. It tilted awkwardly, almost slipping. Before I had time to think, I crossed the street, calling out without planning to. "Do you need a hand?" My voice sounded too bright in the quiet morning. He smiled, grateful but not embarrassed, and stepped aside just enough for me to grab one corner. "Thank you," he said, and his voice had an easy warmth to it that felt unfamiliar, almost disarming. Together we carried the box up the short path to his porch. It wasn't heavy, not really, but the act of helping, of being useful, felt heavier in meaning than it should have. Inside, his home was still chaos. Stacks of books leaned against walls, a single chair sat in the middle of the living room as if it had been placed there absent-mindedly. He apologized for the mess, though it wasn't necessary, and I laughed softly, the sound surprising me. "I remember when we moved in," I said, looking around. "It took us months to stop tripping over boxes." He grinned, and for a moment, it was easy. Just two neighbors sharing a small, ordinary task. But under that ordinariness was something I didn't want to name. I could feel it in the way my hand brushed his when we pushed the box into place, in the way my breath hitched even though the movement was so slight it could have been nothing. When we stepped back outside, the sky had started to darken again. The wind carried that damp, metallic scent that comes before a storm. He glanced upward, frowning slightly. "Looks like it's coming back," he said. I nodded, though I didn't move to leave. The rain started abruptly, fat drops splattering the pavement. He reached for a jacket draped over the porch rail and held it out without thinking. "You'll get soaked," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. I almost refused out of habit, out of the reflex to not accept things I wasn't meant to, but the rain was already soaking through my sweater. I slipped into the jacket, its fabric warm from his body. Something about that small kindness felt too intimate, too personal, and yet I couldn't bring myself to shrug it off. We both laughed awkwardly as we stepped closer under the shallow porch roof, like two people caught by surprise in weather they hadn't prepared for. The rain came harder, hitting the steps in silver sheets, and we stood close, not touching, but close enough that the air felt charged. I don't know what exactly made it happen. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on mine, or the fact that we were standing in the quiet of the rain, sharing breath. Maybe it was that I hadn't felt truly seen in so long that when someone finally did, I leaned toward it like a starving plant toward light. We didn't talk about it, didn't plan it, didn't even think. We kissed. It lasted a heartbeat, maybe two, and then it was over. I stepped back first, my chest tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. His face mirrored mine, surprise, confusion, something unspoken neither of us dared name. The rain still poured, but the world felt oddly still. I handed him back his jacket, mumbling something I couldn't remember later, and walked home quickly, my shoes splashing through puddles. By the time I closed my front door behind me, my hands were shaking. I pressed my back to the wood and waited for guilt to hit me like a wave. But it didn't, not exactly. Instead, there was something quieter, more unsettling, a tremor of life, a reminder that I could still feel. In the kitchen, the bracelet my husband had given me the night before glinted under the weak afternoon light. I slid it off, placing it on the counter as though its presence had grown too heavy to bear. My lips still tingled faintly, and I touched them absent-mindedly, as if to confirm what had just happened. The day ended as they always did. My husband came home late, tired, distracted. He asked about dinner, mentioned a client call, glanced at me without really seeing me. I answered automatically, my voice steady though inside everything had shifted. Lying in bed that night, I replayed it all, not to savor it, but to understand it. The offer of help, the rain, the jacket, the kiss. It felt like a series of accidents, but I knew better. Somewhere between the boxes and the porch, between curiosity and connection, something had begun. I stared at the ceiling, hearing the rain on the roof, and realized that nothing in my house had changed. Not the furniture, not the silence, not my husband's steady breathing beside me. And yet, nothing was the same. The next morning, I woke to the familiar sound of my husband moving through the kitchen, opening cupboards, the scrape of a chair against the floor. It was all so ordinary, the same rhythm we had shared for decades, but I felt disoriented, as if the world I woke into wasn't quite the same as the one I had left behind the night before. I went downstairs, forcing my expression into something neutral. He was already at the table, glasses perched low on his nose as he skimmed the newspaper. There was a half-empty mug of coffee in front of him, and the steam curled upward in lazy spirals. He looked up briefly, smiled absently, and asked if I wanted toast. His voice was calm, his smile genuine enough. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered what it would feel like to tell him everything right there, with his paper folded neatly and the butter knife resting on the edge of the plate. Of course, I didn't. Instead, I sat opposite him, pouring coffee into my cup, my hand steady despite the turmoil beneath my skin. He started talking about work, something about a client, a delayed shipment, but his words became a distant hum. My mind wasn't in that kitchen. It was across the street, on a rain-slicked porch, remembering a kiss that had already lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest. I tried to bury it under chores. After breakfast, I folded laundry, rearranged the pantry, scrubbed a sink that didn't need scrubbing. But every quiet moment brought it back, the sudden closeness, the warmth of the jacket, the way we hadn't spoken about it, hadn't dared to. By early afternoon, I needed to leave the house. I told myself it was to buy groceries, but my car seemed to steer itself past the usual store and toward the small market on the edge of town. I lingered by the produce, choosing apples one by one as if their weight might ground me. And then I saw him. He was standing near the bread aisle, holding a list, looking slightly lost. The sight of him here, among the ordinary clutter of shopping carts and plastic bags, was almost jarring. He noticed me at nearly the same moment. For a second, we both froze. "Hi," he said, after what felt like too long. His voice was easy, like nothing had happened, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed that thought. I managed to return the greeting, my voice quiet but steady. We talked about the bread he couldn't find, and I pointed him to the right shelf. It was nothing, just neighborly conversation, the kind anyone might overhear and dismiss. But under the surface, there was a tension that neither of us named. When we parted, it was with a polite nod, like we were pretending we didn't share a secret. I came home with bags heavier than they should have been, though I couldn't remember half of what I had bought. My husband was in the yard, wrestling with the lawnmower. He asked about dinner plans, and I gave a vague answer, already knowing my thoughts would wander elsewhere no matter what we ate. That evening, he brought home flowers, roses, red and bright, wrapped in cellophane that crinkled when he handed them to me. "Thought you'd like these," he said, almost shyly. I thanked him, but the gesture felt rehearsed. Not insincere, exactly, but something practiced, like a step in a routine he hadn't performed in a while. I placed the roses in a vase, arranging the stems carefully, but they smelled too strong, almost artificial. We ate dinner together, the conversation dipping into silence too often, like water pooling in cracks. I caught myself studying his face across the table, wondering how much he noticed about me, about the way I moved, the way my voice wavered. Maybe nothing. Or maybe more than I thought. Later, as he flipped through channels in the living room, I stood by the sink washing dishes, staring at the reflection of my own face in the window. I didn't recognize the woman looking back entirely. She looked the same, but her thoughts weren't where they used to be. When we went to bed, he kissed my cheek goodnight, the same way he had for years. It was a small kiss, soft and brief, and it landed like it always had, comfortable, familiar. But as I lay there, listening to the quiet of the house, I realized how far that comfort stretched, and how thin it had become. I turned toward the ceiling, my hands folded over my stomach, and let the truth sink in. One single, fleeting kiss had split my life into two pieces, the one before, and the one after. And I didn't know which one I wanted more. The following days blurred into one another, each one carrying that same strange weight. It wasn't as though anything dramatic had changed, the house still looked the same, my routine stayed predictable, but underneath, I felt like someone had shifted the foundation. I woke earlier than usual, wandering through the rooms before the sun came up, touching familiar objects as if they might somehow anchor me. I avoided looking out the window, though I couldn't stop listening for sounds from across the street, the scrape of a box, the low thud of something heavy set down, a door opening and closing. The kiss hung between us like invisible static. Neither of us mentioned it, but the silence wasn't absence. It was presence, thick and unspoken. I told myself to focus on my marriage, on my husband. That morning, he surprised me by suggesting we take a weekend trip. He framed it casually, "We haven't gone anywhere in a while, maybe we should get away," but the way his voice wavered made me wonder if he sensed something, even if he couldn't name it. I nodded, said we'd talk about it, but my heart wasn't in the conversation. The thought of packing bags and smiling through another forced attempt at reconnecting felt exhausting. It wasn't that I didn't want to try, it was that I didn't know if there was anything left to try for. By the third day, I convinced myself to run errands I didn't really need. A few items from the pharmacy, a loaf of bread we still had plenty of. When I returned, his car was in the driveway again. He was crouched by a stack of boxes, scribbling something on the side with a thick black marker. I almost walked straight inside. Almost. Instead, I found myself hesitating by the mailbox, pretending to sort through envelopes I hadn't even pulled out yet. He noticed me, waved with that same easy gesture as before. "How's the unpacking going?" I called, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. He shrugged lightly. "Slow. I think I own more books than furniture." I smiled, the smallest smile, but it felt like a confession. We talked briefly, about things that meant nothing on the surface. Which trash day was recycling? Which corner store had better produce? But underneath every casual word there was something else, something we didn't touch. I told myself that was the end of it, that I'd said what I needed to and could go inside, close the door, and let the day move on. But then the wind shifted, carrying a faint chill, and I saw the way he rubbed his arm absently, almost like he'd been caught off guard by the weather. It struck me how easy it was to notice those little things about him now. Things I barely noticed about my husband anymore. That night, my husband came home later than usual, distracted and drained. He dropped his keys into the bowl by the door and set his phone down on the table, immediately checking his messages again moments later. He talked about work as we ate dinner, words spilling like stones into the space between us. I nodded in the right places, but my mind kept drifting. I wondered if it showed on my face, if he could see the split-second pauses before I answered. After dinner, he brought up the weekend trip again, this time with more insistence. He suggested a coastal town a few hours away, somewhere we hadn't been in years. It might be good for us, he said, and the weight in his voice made me feel guilty, though guilt wasn't enough to bring me closer to him. That night, in bed, I tried to imagine what it would feel like to go on that trip. Whether I would come back feeling anything different. But I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it would just be another layer of pretending, another attempt to plaster over cracks that had already become part of the structure. The next day, I avoided going outside altogether. I moved between rooms aimlessly, starting chores and abandoning them halfway. But by late afternoon, restlessness got the better of me. I decided to drive to the post office, though there was nothing urgent to mail. When I returned, his car was gone, but the porch light was on, a faint glow even though the sky hadn't fully darkened. I stood there for a long moment before unlocking my own door. It struck me then how much had shifted in such a short time. Just a week ago, he was simply a new neighbor. Now, every movement, every conversation, every glance felt layered with meaning. That evening, my husband came home with another gesture of thoughtfulness, a small box of chocolates this time. He placed them on the counter with a hopeful look, like he wanted me to see the effort. I thanked him, of course. I always did. But as I unwrapped one piece, I wondered if he thought these tokens were enough. If he thought gifts could take the place of presents. Later, I stood at the kitchen window, looking at the faint glow across the street. The chocolates sat on the counter, untouched after the first bite, too sweet, too heavy. I thought about the kiss again, not replaying it like a scene, but feeling the way it had cracked something open inside me. I didn't want to lean into it, not fully. But I also couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. And standing there, in that quiet kitchen, I realized that nothing had been normal since. Not the mornings, not the dinners, not the air between the two houses across the street. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't drama. It was something subtler, but just as powerful, the sense that the life I'd known was shifting, inch by inch, and there was no undoing it. The next morning began with an unusual brightness, sunlight cutting across the kitchen table, making everything look sharper, more revealing. I tried to let that light seep into me, to chase away the gray weight I'd been carrying for days, but it only seemed to make everything clearer, the cracks in the walls, the empty spaces in our conversations, the quiet I'd been trying to ignore. My husband had left early for work again, his mug still damp in the sink, a folded note by the coffee pot reminding me to think about that weekend trip. His handwriting had the same rushed carelessness it always did, slanted letters and half-finished words. I stared at the note longer than I meant to, wondering if this was his way of reaching for me, or if it was just another habit he couldn't break. I decided to go for a walk, telling myself it was for the fresh air, though I already knew where my steps would lead me. The street was quiet, a light breeze pushing leaves across the pavement. When I passed his house, the front door was open, boxes scattered in uneven piles as though he'd been searching for something and gave up halfway. He was standing by his car, loading a few things into the trunk, tools, a folded tarp, a battered cardboard box that looked ready to fall apart. When he saw me, he smiled, that easy, unguarded smile that felt like sunlight after a long winter. "You're out early," he said, voice calm, like we were just two neighbors on an ordinary day. I nodded, my hands twisting in my pockets. I needed to stretch my legs. The exchange was so simple, but my chest tightened anyway. There was nothing remarkable in the words, but everything felt charged beneath them. I told myself I should keep walking. I told myself not to step closer. But then he mentioned that he had finally found his coffee maker, buried in a box marked winter coats. I laughed, and it came out too easily, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in a while. "Come in for a cup?" he asked, almost offhand, like it didn't matter. I hesitated, but I didn't walk away. Inside, his living room looked slightly less chaotic than before, fewer boxes, more signs of a life slowly settling in. A framed photo sat on the mantel now, and a throw blanket was draped casually across the couch. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something else, something clean, like cedar or soap. He brewed 2 cups and handed one to me. Our fingers brushed as he passed the mug, and it was such a small thing, but I felt it anyway, a spark traveling up my arm. We talked, or at least pretended to. About furniture he still needed to buy, about the neighborhood, about the best time to put out the trash. But there were pauses, those long, heavy silences where everything unsaid seemed to hum between us. I set my cup down on the counter, suddenly aware of how close we were standing. There was no rain this time, no storm pushing us under the same porch roof. Just sunlight filtering through the window and the sound of the coffee machine ticking as it cooled. He reached for my hand. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet, steady gesture, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world seemed to narrow to the space between us, to the warmth of his fingers around mine. And then, before I could stop myself, we kissed. This one wasn't like the first. The first had been sudden, an accident of rain and closeness. This was deliberate. Quiet, but deliberate. When it ended, we stood there for a moment, the silence thicker than before. I stepped back first, my breath unsteady. I murmured something about needing to get back. I don't even remember what words I used, just that they sounded thin, almost fragile. He nodded, not pressing, not asking, his expression unreadable but not cold. Walking home, the sunlight felt harsher now, like it was revealing everything I didn't want to see. My hands shook slightly as I turned the doorknob, like I was afraid someone would be waiting on the other side to demand explanations. The house was empty, of course. My husband wouldn't be home for hours. I leaned against the counter, staring at the bracelet on my wrist, the one he had given me days ago. It glinted in the light, and suddenly it felt like a weight, as if the metal itself knew what I'd done. I slipped it off and set it aside, the soft clink against the counter loud in the quiet kitchen. The rest of the day passed in fragments, folding laundry without remembering doing it, making tea and letting it go cold. Every thought circled back to the same moment, to the quiet decision we'd both made in that small kitchen across the street. By the time my husband came home, I had managed to put the bracelet back on, to prepare dinner, to wear the same practiced smile I'd worn for years. He talked about work. I listened, or pretended to. But inside, everything had shifted again. This wasn't just a mistake to forget. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was something else now, something I couldn't name but couldn't deny. The days after that second kiss felt like standing on a thin sheet of ice, aware of every creak beneath my feet. I moved through my routines, but each step felt measured, every conversation rehearsed. My husband didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. He came home each night carrying the weight of his day, dropping it quietly on the table between us like an invisible package neither of us opened. One evening he suggested dinner out, a nicer place than we usually went, the kind of restaurant we hadn't visited in years. He presented it as casually as he could, but I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the way he was testing the idea, gauging my reaction. I agreed, smiling, because that's what I'd always done. But inside, the thought of sitting across from him under dim lights, pretending to be the version of ourselves we used to be, felt exhausting. When the evening came, I put on a dress I hadn't worn in months. It still fit, but not the same way. The zipper caught for a second, and I stared at myself in the mirror, wondering who this woman was, the one smoothing her hair, the one about to sit across from her husband and pretend everything was fine. At the restaurant, the tablecloths were white and stiff, the kind that make every glass clink louder than it should. He ordered a bottle of wine, his voice careful, as though the right drink might soften the silence between us. We talked, but the words felt thin. He asked about my day, and I told him about errands, about laundry, about nothing. But my mind wasn't in that room. It was across the street, in a kitchen with unpacked boxes, in a place where the air felt lighter and heavier all at once. I hated myself for that. I hated how easy it was for my thoughts to drift. The waiter brought dessert, a slice of cake we didn't finish. My husband tried to reach for my hand across the table. I let him, but the touch felt practiced, a gesture out of habit rather than instinct. On the drive home, the streets blurred by. He hummed along softly to a song on the radio, and for a moment I remembered the man he used to be, the one who once held my face in his hands like it was the only thing that mattered. I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost startled me. Back at the house, I thanked him for the dinner. He smiled, relieved maybe, as though the evening had been a success. I smiled back, because that's what I'd always done. But later, when the house was quiet and he was asleep, I sat in the darkened living room staring at the bracelet on my wrist. It glimmered faintly in the streetlight coming through the curtains. It should have felt like love. It felt like a question I couldn't answer. The next day, I tried to distract myself with small tasks. Dusting shelves that didn't need dusting, refolding towels, rearranging pantry items. But distraction wasn't enough. Every sound from outside, a car door closing, footsteps on pavement, pulled my attention like a magnet. By late afternoon, I stepped outside to get the mail. He was there, across the street, leaning against his car, talking to someone on the phone. His voice was low, his expression unreadable, but when he saw me, he lifted his hand in that small wave. I waved back before I could think. The day passed in pieces after that. I cooked dinner but couldn't remember chopping the vegetables. I set the table but didn't notice the fork I placed slightly off-center. My husband came home, kissed my cheek, talked about a colleague who was retiring. I nodded in the right places, my smile automatic. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts circling, heavy but restless. I thought about the bracelet, the dinner, the cake we didn't finish. I thought about the hand I hadn't pulled away, the kiss I hadn't stopped. I realized then that I was no longer standing at the edge of something. I had already stepped over it. And there was no way to pretend I hadn't. The day it happened didn't feel different when it began. I woke up to the same light filtering through the curtains, the same sound of my husband's footsteps in the hallway, the same smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. But there was a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't go away, a sense that all the pretending was starting to fray at the edges. My husband left earlier than usual, kissing me on the cheek like always, his lips barely grazing my skin. He reminded me, as he pulled on his jacket, about the weekend trip he wanted us to take. We could leave Friday, he said, his tone almost hopeful. I nodded, and he left. The door shut softly, but the sound stayed with me. I tried to fill the morning with tasks, changing the sheets, sweeping the porch, watering the plants that didn't need watering. But I couldn't focus. Every time I paused, my mind wandered back to the same place, to the house across the street, to the conversations, the silences, the two kisses that had already changed everything. By noon, I gave up pretending to be busy. I found myself walking across the street without fully deciding to. The air was cool, the kind of weather that made you wrap your arms around yourself. When I reached his door, I hesitated for a moment, then knocked softly. He opened the door almost immediately, like he'd been expecting it, though we both knew he couldn't have been. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even ask why I was there. He just stepped aside, letting me in, the quiet between us louder than words. Inside, his living room was tidier now, though a few boxes still lingered in corners. The space felt lived in, warmer somehow. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to say, unsure why I had come, though we both already knew. I thought I'd return the mug, I said, holding out the coffee cup I'd been meaning to give back for days. It sounded flimsy, almost foolish, but he accepted it with a small nod, placing it on the counter. We stood there, facing each other, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. I tried to speak, to explain, to give this moment a reason, but nothing came out. And then it didn't matter. We spent the night together. When it was over, the silence felt different. Not lighter, not exactly, but clearer. I sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of what I had done settle into me like cold water. My hands were still, but my heart felt like it was beating in a room too small for it. He didn't say much. Neither did I. There wasn't anything to say. Eventually, I stood, gathering myself as if I could somehow put everything back where it had been. I smoothed my clothes, fixed my hair, all those small rituals of leaving, though nothing could disguise the fact that I wasn't the same person who had walked in. He walked me to the door, but not all the way across the street. He stayed at the threshold, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady on mine. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Each step felt deliberate, like the ground might give way if I moved too quickly. When I reached my house, I paused at the door, my hand on the knob, my reflection faint in the glass. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, the kitchen neat, the table cleared, the bracelet still glinting faintly on the counter where I'd placed it earlier. But standing there, I knew nothing was the same anymore. I leaned against the door for a moment, closing my eyes, letting the weight of the day press down. I knew there would be no undoing it. No pretending it hadn't happened. And no going back to who I had been before. The morning after felt heavier than I expected. The sunlight spilling through the curtains didn't feel gentle, it felt exposing, as if every corner of the room had been lit up, leaving nowhere to hide. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my untouched coffee, its surface gone cold while my thoughts circled endlessly. I couldn't stop thinking about the walk home, how deliberate every step had been, how the silence around me had felt louder than any storm. Even now, in the quiet of my own house, that silence seemed to hum in the walls. My husband had already left for work, as he always did, but there was a note on the counter, written in his hurried, slanted handwriting. Thinking we should book that weekend trip. Let me know. He'd drawn a small arrow to underline the words, a little flourish he used when he wanted to emphasize something. I picked up the note and held it, staring at the ink as though it could explain everything I was feeling. It didn't. It only reminded me of the life that still waited for me here, the life I had just fractured in a way that could never fully be mended. I busied myself with chores, hoping to scrub the feeling away. I folded laundry with more force than necessary, wiped down countertops that were already spotless, rearranged the dishes in the cupboards. The motions gave my hands something to do, but they didn't quiet my mind. By mid-morning, I caught myself staring out the window again. His house looked still, the curtains drawn in one room, the door closed. I wondered if he was thinking about me, or if he'd already moved on with his day, if last night sat in his chest as heavily as it sat in mine. I told myself not to go outside. I told myself to stay in this house, to keep the boundaries that had already been crossed from blurring even further. But when I saw the mail truck pull up, I walked out anyway, clutching a handful of envelopes I didn't need to check. He wasn't outside, and the small sting of disappointment surprised me. I stood at the mailbox longer than necessary, sorting through the letters like they held some secret message. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted to happen if he had stepped out the door. Back inside, I found my husband's bracelet on the counter, the one he had given me days before. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, feeling its cold weight. It was supposed to be a symbol of his care, but now it felt like something else entirely, like a reminder of the two lives I was trying to balance, and failing. Around noon, my husband called. His voice was tired, distracted, but he asked what I was doing, if I'd thought more about the trip. "I'll make the reservations tonight," he said, almost like a promise. I murmured that it sounded nice, and the word felt thin, empty. After the call, I sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen. For the first time, I let myself think about what I'd done in plain words, without excuses, without softening the edges. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And yet, part of me felt more awake than I had in years. That truth unsettled me more than the guilt. By late afternoon, I decided to cook an elaborate dinner, something I hadn't done in months. It was an effort, I told myself, to remind my husband, to remind myself, that there was still something here worth holding on to. I set the table carefully, lighting a candle even though it was only Tuesday, even though it felt forced. When my husband came home, he noticed. He smiled, kissed me on the cheek, said, "This is nice." But as we ate, he talked about work, about the client who kept rescheduling meetings, about the hotel options for the trip. I nodded, smiled, asked the right questions. On the surface, it looked like connection. Underneath, it felt like we were both just playing the roles we'd memorized long ago. After dinner, he gave me another gift, a small scarf this time, folded neatly, tag still on. "Saw it on my way home," he said, the same way he'd said it with the bracelet, the chocolates. I thanked him, and my voice sounded like someone else's. Later, after he'd gone upstairs to read, I stood in the kitchen holding the scarf, feeling its soft fabric between my fingers. It should have felt like love. It should have felt like effort. Instead, it felt like it was too late. I placed the scarf on the counter next to the bracelet and stared at them both. They looked like offerings to a version of me that didn't exist anymore. When I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs, I knew one thing with certainty: I couldn't go back to who I was before. And I wasn't sure who I was becoming now. The days that followed didn't bring the relief I thought they might. I had imagined, in some quiet corner of my mind, that after that night there would be some sort of clarity, a clean dividing line between what I felt and what I should do. But there was no clarity, only a slow, pressing weight that seemed to follow me from room to room. I woke up every morning to the same routine, but everything felt slightly out of place, like furniture that had been moved just an inch. My husband still kissed my cheek before leaving for work, still left little notes about groceries or weekend plans, still tried to make small gestures that looked like effort. But his efforts felt distant, like he was reaching for someone who wasn't there anymore. And maybe I wasn't. I kept thinking about the man across the street. Not constantly, but in sudden, sharp moments, pouring coffee, folding towels, standing at the sink. I'd picture his face, the way he smiled, the way he paused before speaking, like his words carried weight. And then I'd feel guilt flood me, heavy and unrelenting. He started keeping a bit of distance after that night. I noticed it immediately. The lights in his house stayed on, but he didn't step out as much, didn't linger in his yard, didn't wave across the street. Part of me was grateful. Part of me hated it. One afternoon, I saw him carrying a box out to his car. Our eyes met for just a second, a fleeting glance, but it said more than any conversation could have. He wasn't avoiding me exactly, he was cautious. He understood, as I did, that everything we did now had consequences, and the space between us felt like an unspoken agreement to tread carefully. Meanwhile, my husband seemed to sense something he couldn't name. He wasn't suspicious, not exactly, but he became more attentive in small, almost clumsy ways. He lingered longer at the table after dinner, asked if I wanted to take walks in the evenings, brought home flowers more often, each bouquet slightly too bright, slightly too formal. I tried to respond, to meet him halfway, but my heart wasn't where it used to be. It wasn't even where I wanted it to be. One evening, he came home with a stack of brochures for vacation spots, quiet coastal towns, mountain cabins, lakeside retreats. He spread them out on the table like an offering, his voice almost hopeful as he said, "We could choose together." I sat down, picked one up, and stared at the glossy picture of a lighthouse, the waves crashing against the rocks below. It should have stirred something in me. It didn't. That night, after he went upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, staring at the stack of brochures. They looked like postcards from a life we used to have, one that I couldn't find my way back to. The guilt was there, always, but it was tangled with something harder to name. It wasn't just about what I'd done, it was about the way I felt now, the way that night had woken something in me that I didn't know how to silence again. The next morning, I stood at the window with my coffee, watching the street. His car was gone, but his porch light was still on, glowing faintly even in daylight. It struck me how much had changed between the two houses facing each other. I tried to fill the day with tasks again. I reorganized drawers that didn't need reorganizing, polished silverware we hadn't used in years. But none of it could quiet the tension building inside me. By late afternoon, I stepped outside to water the plants, though the soil was still damp from the rain 2 days earlier. I glanced across the street, half hoping to see him, half hoping not to. The air felt heavy, like the pause before a storm, even though the sky was clear. When my husband came home that evening, he noticed the stack of brochures still on the counter. He picked one up, tapped the picture of a cabin surrounded by trees, and said, "This one looks peaceful. Maybe it's what we need." I smiled, but it felt like a gesture, not a feeling. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, staring at the ceiling. I thought about everything, the notes, the flowers, the brochures, the man across the street, the night I couldn't take back. I thought about how easy it had been to cross that line. And how impossible it felt to ever step back over it. That morning, I woke before dawn, the world outside still cloaked in a deep, gentle gray. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold, the steam nothing more than a memory. The silence in the house was different now, not just quiet but weighty, filled with all the words we weren't saying. My husband's alarm went off in the other room. He moved through the house as he always did, shower running, closet doors opening and closing, the creak of the floorboards a familiar pattern. He came into the kitchen with tired eyes and a hopeful smile, placing his hand gently on my shoulder before he poured himself coffee. "We could talk about the trip tonight," he said. "Maybe pick a place together." I nodded, offering the kind of smile that belonged to a woman on a different path than the one she'd chosen. He kissed my forehead, and for a moment, I wanted to turn into him, to wrap my arms around his waist and ask for forgiveness, for understanding, for something that could never quite be given. But I couldn't. I wasn't that woman anymore. After he left for work, I sat in the stillness, watching the light change as the sun rose. I thought about everything that had happened, every note, every bouquet, every awkward attempt at reconnection, every gift that felt more like a peace offering than a promise. I thought about the house across the street, the man who lived there, the way our stories had collided and changed the shape of my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. There was no one moment I could point to, no single thing that explained how I got here. It was 1,000 small things, the empty seats at the dinner table, the silent drives home from the grocery store, the way the air shifted when he smiled at me from his porch. It was the absence of touch, the hunger for something unnameable, the longing for a version of myself I thought I had lost. I spent the morning cleaning, not because anything needed it, but because I needed to move. I wiped down counters, swept floors, rearranged dishes in the cupboards for the second time that week. Each task was a distraction, but the thoughts pressed in anyway, insistent and relentless. By midday, I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the street. The house across the way was quiet, the porch empty. I wondered if he felt the same heaviness, the same weight of choices made and doors quietly closing behind us. My husband called from work, asking what I wanted for dinner. "Surprise me," I said, and my voice sounded soft, almost kind, even as I felt my heart retreating further. The afternoon drifted by. I tried to read, but the words slid off the page, refusing to stick. I tried to nap, but my mind circled restlessly, chasing thoughts that led nowhere. When my husband came home, he carried groceries and a new bottle of wine. He made pasta, humming to himself, moving through the kitchen with a comfort that was both familiar and foreign. We ate together, making small talk about nothing, the weather, the neighbors, the movie we'd half-watched the night before. After dinner, he brought out a stack of travel magazines, spreading them across the table. He pointed to places he thought I'd like, the coast, the mountains, a city we'd visited years ago. I listened, nodded, made the right noises. But inside, I was standing at a crossroads I didn't know how to leave. Later, as the house quieted and the sky deepened to indigo, I found myself on the porch, the air cool and gentle against my skin. I looked across the street at the neighbor's house, dark, still, ordinary. Nothing about it would tell a stranger what had happened, what had changed. The truth was, I didn't know how to end this story. There was no neat resolution, no simple answer to the question of what comes next. I had spent so long living by habit, by routine, by the silent agreements of marriage, that I didn't know how to break them without shattering everything else in the process. But I knew, standing there in the dark, that I could never go back to who I had been. The woman who watched life through the window, who measured her days by what was missing, was gone. In her place was someone older, lonelier, but also, somehow, more awake. I went inside, turned off the lights, and climbed the stairs to bed. My husband was already there, reading, his glasses perched on his nose. He looked up, smiled, patted the space beside him. I slipped beneath the covers, closed my eyes, and let the silence settle between us. In that quiet, I understood, there are some choices you live with forever. There are some truths you never say out loud. And some stories that end, not with a goodbye, but with the slow, steady turning of a page.